Tonight, the boundaries between orthodox and heretical dissolve like incense smoke rising toward ancient stars. Feel the air heavy with desert sand and the phantom scent of hidden parchments, where early Christianity once bloomed in forms the modern world has forgotten. If this journey touches your soul, join us again and whisper from where you listen to us. Now, dim the lights, breathe deeply. Let us dream with memories that are not our own. I walk across the sun-baked stones of 2nd century Egypt, where the Nile's fertile banks nourish not just crops, but ideas that will challenge the very foundations of Christian belief. The year is 150 CE, and Christianity is not yet the monolithic faith of later centuries, but a garden of diverse traditions, each claiming to preserve the true teachings of Jesus. Here in the workshops of Alexandria and the caves of the Egyptian desert, scribes work by lamplight to preserve gospels that tell stories the Orthodox Church will spend centuries trying to erase. The morning light filters through narrow windows of a hidden scriptorium, illuminating dust motes that dance like spirits above copying tables where forbidden texts take shape. I touch the phantom papyrus and feel the weight of dangerous knowledge, gospels that speak of Jesus in ways that would horrify later bishops, teachings that present salvation not as submission but as gnosis, the direct knowledge of divine truth that needs no priestly intermediary. Brother Valentinus, a brilliant theologian whose followers will be branded as heretics, moves between the copying tables with the quiet authority of someone who believes he possesses the true interpretation of Christ's message. His students, both men and women, for these early communities often embraced equality that Orthodox Christianity will later reject. Work with reverent concentration, their reed pens scratching across papyrus as they preserve texts that Orthodox bishops are already beginning to condemn. The wind carries whispers of controversy from the great cities of the empire. In Rome, Bishop Irenaeus writes furiously against the false gnosis of these alternative gospels. In Antioch, church fathers debate which texts truly preserve apostolic tradition. But here in Egypt, far from the centers of emerging orthodoxy, Christian communities continue to read and cherish gospels that present Jesus as a teacher of hidden wisdom, rather than a sacrificial lamb. I observe the careful ritual of manuscript creation in this underground world. Each gospel is copied not just as text, but as sacred object, its words believed to carry transformative power for those who truly understand their meaning. The Gospel of Thomas, with its collection of Jesus' secret sayings, passes from scribe to scribe like a whispered prayer. The Gospel of Mary Magdalene, with its radical vision of feminine spiritual authority, is hidden away in clay jars that will sleep beneath desert sands for nearly 2 millennia. The atmosphere in these hidden scriptoriums vibrates with the tension of preservation and persecution. These scribes know they are preserving something precious and dangerous, texts that offer alternative visions of Christian truth. Gospels that present Jesus not as the suffering servant of Orthodox theology, but as a revealer of divine mysteries, accessible to all who seek with pure hearts. The scent of papyrus and ink mingles with frankincense burned in small shrines where these communities worship according to their own understanding of Christian truth. Their prayers sound different from those that will echo in later cathedrals, more mystical, more focused on inner transformation than external salvation, more concerned with gnosis than faith.
As I walk among these phantom figures of early Christian diversity, I realize that what we are witnessing is not heresy, but the natural flowering of religious creativity in an age before orthodoxy crystallized into rigid doctrine. These lost gospels represent roads not taken in Christian development, alternative interpretations of Jesus' message that were suppressed not because they were false, but because they were inconvenient to the emerging institutional church. The evening light slants through the scriptorium windows, casting long shadows across tables where dangerous truths are being preserved for an uncertain future. I can almost hear the whispered debates among these early Christians as they struggle to understand the meaning of Jesus' life and teachings. Some emphasize his divinity, others his humanity. Some see salvation in his death, others in his teachings. Some organize themselves hierarchically, others embrace radical equality. The tragedy that will unfold over the coming centuries is not just the loss of these texts, but the loss of this diversity itself, the narrowing of Christian possibility from a broad river of spiritual exploration to the carefully channeled stream of orthodox doctrine. The lost Gospels represent not just alternative texts, but alternative ways of being Christian, alternative understandings of what it means to follow Jesus. Standing in this phantom scriptorium as darkness falls over ancient Egypt, I understand that we are witnessing the preservation of Christianity's suppressed memory. The record of a time when the faith was young enough to embrace mystery, diverse enough to include radically different interpretations, and confident enough in its truth to allow questioning and exploration. These forbidden texts carry within them the DNA of a Christianity that might have been, a faith that valued wisdom over obedience, inner transformation over external conformity, the authority of personal revelation over institutional control.
The candlelight flickers against papyrus walls in a hidden chamber beneath Alexandria, where the most dangerous Christians in the Roman Empire gathered to preserve truths that bishops in distant cities have declared heretical. I descend stone steps, worn smooth by centuries of secret footsteps, entering a world where Christianity wears faces that Orthodox history has tried to forget. The year is 180 CE, and the Gnostic communities of Egypt work with desperate urgency to save their sacred texts from the growing persecution of emerging church authorities. Sister Marcella, a woman whose very presence in this leadership role would scandalize Orthodox Christians, oversees the copying of the Gospel of Mary, with hands that tremble not from fear but from the weight of sacred responsibility. In her community, women teach and prophesy as equals, following what they believe to be the true example of Jesus, who revealed his deepest mysteries to Mary Magdalene rather than to Peter or the other male apostles. The scriptorium operates in shifts, with scribes working through the night to multiply copies of texts that church fathers like Tertullian and Hippolytus have begun condemning as demonic deceptions. Each manuscript represents not just preserved words, but preserved possibility, alternative visions of Christian truth that emphasize direct spiritual experience over institutional mediation, inner transformation over external ritual, the divine spark within humanity over human sinfulness and dependence. I watch Brother Basilides, a theologian whose cosmological visions rival those of any ancient philosopher, as he dictates his commentary on the secret teachings of Jesus. His understanding of Christianity is breathtakingly complex, a system that sees the material world as the creation of a lesser deity,
salvation as the awakening of divine consciousness within the human soul, and Jesus as a revealer of hidden truths rather than a sacrificial victim. The theological discussions that fill these underground chambers would astonish modern Christians with their sophistication and their radical departures from orthodox doctrine. These Gnostics debate the nature of the divine feminine, the role of Sophia, wisdom, in creation, the meaning of Jesus' most cryptic sayings, and the possibility that salvation comes not through faith in Christ's death, but through gnosis, the direct, experiential knowledge of divine truth. The Gospel of Philip, copied carefully by a young scribe named Theodotus, contains passages that will make Orthodox bishops shudder with horror. The companion of the Savior is Mary Magdalene. Christ loved her more than all the disciples and used to kiss her often on her mouth. The rest of the disciples were offended by it and expressed disapproval. Such texts present a Jesus who valued intimate spiritual relationships, who may have been married, who treated women as spiritual equals.
I observe the careful process by which these communities preserve not just texts, but entire alternative traditions of Christian practice. The Gospel of Thomas, with its emphasis on finding the divine kingdom within oneself, is accompanied by meditation practices and contemplative techniques. The Apocryphon of John, with its complex mythology of divine emanations, comes with detailed instructions for spiritual ascent through the heavenly realms. The economic and social organization of these Gnostic communities reflects their theological commitments. Unlike the increasingly hierarchical Orthodox churches, many Gnostic groups practice radical equality, with leadership roles rotating among members regardless of gender. Their meetings take place in private homes rather than public buildings. Their teachers support themselves through secular work rather than church donations. Their authority comes from spiritual insight rather than apostolic succession. The persecution they face is not yet systematic, but is growing more intense with each passing year. Orthodox bishops, consolidating their power in major cities, have begun issuing lists of approved and forbidden texts. The Muratorian canon, circulating in Rome, explicitly excludes Gnostic Gospels from acceptable Christian reading. Local magistrates, influenced by Orthodox leaders, occasionally raid Gnostic meetings and confiscate their manuscripts. Yet the diversity of these alternative Christianities is remarkable. The Valentinians, followers of the brilliant theologian Valentinus, develop elaborate mythologies explaining the origin of evil and the path to salvation. The Sethians trace their lineage back to Seth, the third son of Adam, and preserve texts that blend Christian themes with Jewish mysticism. The Thomasine Christians, centered around the Gospel of Thomas, emphasize the sayings of Jesus over the story of his death and resurrection. I watch as an elderly Gnostic teacher named Ptolemy instructs a group of new initiates in the interpretation of Jesus' parables. His method is allegorical, finding hidden meanings beneath the surface narrative. The parable of the sower becomes a description of different types of souls and their capacity for receiving divine truth. The parable of the pearl of great price becomes an allegory for the soul's recognition of its divine nature.
The manuscripts being copied in these underground chambers represent more than alternative gospels. They preserve entire alternative ways of understanding the human condition, the nature of divinity, and the purpose of existence. The Gnostic emphasis on knowledge over faith, on inner transformation over external salvation, on the divine potential within humanity over human sinfulness, offers a radically different vision of what Christianity might become. As midnight approaches and the scribes continue their sacred work by lamplight, I realize that these hidden communities are preserving not just texts, but the memory of Christianity's mystical heart. Their Gospels speak of Jesus as a teacher of wisdom traditions that connect with the deepest currents of ancient spirituality, Egyptian mysteries, Greek philosophy, Jewish mysticism, Persian dualism. The tragedy unfolding in these candlelit chambers is not just the suppression of alternative texts, but the narrowing of Christian possibility itself. The rich diversity of early Christian thought, the creative theological speculation, the mystical practices and egalitarian communities, all of this will be swept away by the tide of orthodox consolidation that is already beginning to rise across the Roman Empire. Standing among these phantom scribes as they work to preserve their dangerous truths, I understand that we are witnessing one of history's great might-have-beens, the preservation of a Christianity that valued questions over answers, mystery over certainty, the authority of personal spiritual experience over institutional control. These lost Gospels carry within them the genetic code of a faith that might have developed very differently had history taken another turn.
The desert wind carries whispers of a woman whose voice was silenced by centuries of patriarchal interpretation, yet whose words survived in hidden manuscripts that challenge everything Orthodox Christianity teaches about feminine spiritual authority. I walk beside the phantom figure of Mary Magdalene through the hills of ancient Palestine, feeling the weight of secrets that bishops and theologians have spent 2 millennia trying to suppress. In the gospel that bears her name, discovered among the Nag Hammadi texts in 1945, Mary emerges not as the repentant prostitute of later legend, but as the apostle whom Jesus loved most, the disciple to whom he revealed his deepest mysteries, the woman whose spiritual authority threatened the male disciples so profoundly that they sought to exclude her from their circle. Did the Savior really speak with a woman without our knowledge? Peter asks in the text, his jealousy palpable across the centuries. Are we to turn about and all listen to her? Did he prefer her to us? I observe the scene that the Gospel of Mary describes with startling intimacy. Jesus appearing to his disciples after the resurrection, not to commission them for missionary work, as the canonical Gospels suggest, but to reveal the deepest secrets of spiritual ascent. But it is to Mary alone that he explains the most profound mysteries, the journey of the soul through the cosmic spheres, the nature of sin and redemption, the path to ultimate gnosis. The manuscript itself, written in Coptic on papyrus that has survived nearly 2,000 years in the dry Egyptian climate, bears the stars of deliberate mutilation. Pages are missing, torn out, perhaps, by monks who found their contents too dangerous to preserve intact. What remains is fragmentary but revolutionary, a gospel that presents Mary Magdalene as the primary recipient of Jesus' post-resurrection teachings, the apostle who understands his message most completely. I saw the Lord in a vision, Mary tells the other disciples, and I said to him, Lord, I saw you today in a vision. He answered and said to me, Blessed are you that you did not waver at the sight of me, for where the mind is, there is the treasure. This is not the Jesus of Orthodox theology, dying for humanity's sins,
but the Jesus of Gnostic understanding, teaching the path to direct spiritual knowledge. The theological implications of Mary's gospel are staggering. If Jesus revealed his most important teachings to a woman, if he chose her as his primary apostle, if he intended the church to be led by those who possessed gnosis rather than those who claimed apostolic succession, then the entire foundation of patriarchal Christianity crumbles. No wonder the Orthodox Fathers worked so hard to suppress this text and transform Mary Magdalene from apostle to penitent sinner.
I watch the phantom figure of Mary as she teaches the other disciples about the soul's journey through the 7 powers that seek to trap it in material existence. Her description is detailed, mystical, drawing on traditions that connect early Christianity with ancient mystery religions. This is Christianity as initiation rather than salvation, as transformation rather than substitution, as gnosis rather than faith. The reaction of the male disciples in the gospel reveals the gender tensions that plagued early Christian communities. Andrew declares that Mary's teachings are strange ideas, while Peter explodes in anger. Did he really speak privately with a woman and not openly to us? Are we to turn about and all listen to her? Did he prefer her to us? The text presents Levi defending Mary. Peter, you have always been hot-tempered. If the Savior made her worthy, who are you indeed to reject her? This conflict between Mary and Peter represents more than personal jealousy. It symbolizes the struggle between 2 different visions of Christianity. Peter represents the institutional church, with its emphasis on apostolic authority, hierarchical structure, and male leadership. Mary represents the mystical tradition, with its emphasis on direct revelation, spiritual equality, and the authority of gnosis over office. The Gospel of Mary also presents a radically different understanding of sin and salvation. When the disciples ask Jesus about the nature of sin, he responds not with talk of original sin or human depravity, but with a teaching about the soul's entanglement with matter. There is no sin, but it is you who make sin when you do the things that are like the nature of adultery, which is called sin. Sin is not moral failure requiring divine forgiveness, but spiritual ignorance requiring enlightenment. The manuscript's description of the soul's ascent through the cosmic spheres draws on ancient astronomical and mystical traditions that Orthodox Christianity would later reject as pagan. Mary describes encountering the powers of darkness, desire, ignorance, and wrath, each trying to prevent the soul's return to its divine source. This is Christianity as cosmic drama, with salvation understood as the soul's liberation from the forces that bind it to material existence.
I observe the careful way the Gospel of Mary handles the relationship between Jesus and Mary herself. While later Gnostic texts, like the Gospel of Philip, will speak explicitly of their intimate relationship, this Gospel focuses on their spiritual connection. Mary is presented as the disciple who understands Jesus most deeply, who receives his most profound teachings, who serves as the bridge between his earthly ministry and his post-resurrection revelations. The historical Mary Magdalene, glimpsed through the fragments of this suppressed gospel, emerges as a figure of extraordinary spiritual authority. She is not the silent, submissive woman of orthodox imagination, but a teacher, a visionary, a leader whose authority derives not from institutional appointment, but from direct spiritual experience. Her gospel preserves a memory of early Christianity in which women played central roles, in which spiritual authority was based on gnosis rather than gender, in which the church might have developed along very different lines. The suppression of Mary's gospel represents more than the loss of a single text. It symbolizes a systematic erasure of feminine spiritual authority from Christian tradition. By transforming Mary Magdalene from apostle to penitent prostitute, by suppressing the Gospels that recorded her teachings, by excluding women from positions of religious authority, Orthodox Christianity cut itself off from half of its spiritual heritage. As I stand in the phantom chamber where Mary's Gospel was first copied, I realize that this text preserves not just alternative teachings, but an alternative vision of what Christianity might have become. A church that honored Mary's authority alongside Peter's, that valued mystical experience alongside institutional order, that recognized the spiritual equality of women and men, might have developed into something radically different from the patriarchal institution that emerged from the 4th century councils. The desert wind carries Mary's voice across the centuries, speaking words that Orthodox Christianity tried to silence but could not destroy. Be of good cheer, and if you are discouraged, be encouraged in the presence of the different forms of nature. Where the mind is, there is the treasure.
In the shadow of ancient Edessa, where Aramaic voices still echo the language Jesus spoke, I discover a collection of sayings that claim to preserve his most secret teachings. The Gospel of Thomas, written in the tongue closest to Christ's own words, presents not a narrative of death and resurrection, but a treasury of wisdom that transforms the very nature of salvation itself. These are the secret sayings which the living Jesus spoke, and which Didymus Judas Thomas wrote down. The manuscript rests in my phantom hands like a whispered prayer made tangible, its 114 sayings arranged not as story, but as spiritual instruction manual for those seeking the kingdom of heaven within themselves. Unlike the canonical Gospels, with their emphasis on Jesus' sacrificial death, Thomas presents a Christ who saves through teaching rather than dying, who offers gnosis rather than faith, who promises that those who understand his words will not experience death. I walk through the Syrian Christian community where this gospel first took shape, observing scribes who work not to preserve historical narrative, but to capture the essence of transformative wisdom. Brother Judas Thomas, not the doubting apostle of Orthodox tradition, but the twin brother of Jesus in Syrian Christian legend, moves among them with the authority of one who claims to have received these teachings directly from the living Christ. The opening saying strikes like lightning across conventional Christian understanding. Whoever finds the interpretation of these sayings will not experience death. This is not the promise of resurrection after physical death, but the assurance of spiritual immortality through gnosis, the direct experiential knowledge of divine truth that transcends the boundaries of mortality itself. Each saying in Thomas's collection functions like a spiritual riddle, designed not to convey information, but to trigger enlightenment. Jesus said, "If those who lead you say to you, 'See, the kingdom is in the sky,' then the birds of the sky will precede you. If they say to you, 'It is in the sea,' then the fish will precede you. Rather,
The kingdom is inside of you, and it is outside of you. This is Christianity turned inward, salvation understood as the recognition of divine presence within human consciousness. The theological revolution contained in these sayings cannot be overstated. Where Orthodox Christianity will develop elaborate doctrines of original sin, vicarious atonement, and institutional salvation, Thomas presents a Jesus who teaches that the kingdom of heaven is humanity's natural inheritance, accessible to anyone who achieves proper understanding. When you come to know yourselves, then you will become known, and you will realize that it is you who are the sons of the living Father.
I observe the community gatherings where these sayings are studied and contemplated. Unlike the liturgical worship that will characterize Orthodox Christianity, these sessions resemble philosophical schools or mystery religion initiations. Members meditate on individual sayings, share their interpretations, seek to penetrate the hidden meanings that will unlock spiritual transformation. The Gospel of Thomas presents a Jesus who speaks in paradoxes and riddles that challenge conventional thinking. Jesus said, "Blessed is the lion which becomes man when consumed by man, and cursed is the man whom the lion consumes, and the lion becomes man." Such sayings resist simple interpretation, forcing readers into the kind of deep contemplation that Gnostic Christians believed was necessary for spiritual awakening. The manuscript's treatment of gender and spiritual authority proves equally revolutionary. Saying 114, which has scandalized modern readers, records the disciples asking Jesus to send Mary Magdalene away because women do not deserve life. Jesus responds not by agreeing, but by promising to transform her. "I myself shall lead her in order to make her male, so that she too may become a living spirit resembling you males. For every woman who will make herself male will enter the kingdom of heaven." This saying, properly understood within Gnostic symbolism, speaks not of literal gender transformation, but of spiritual transcendence of all dualities, male and female, light and dark, material and spiritual. In Gnostic thought, the divine realm exists beyond such distinctions, and salvation involves returning to the primordial unity that preceded the fall into duality. The economic and social implications of Thomas's teachings prove as radical as their theology. Jesus said, "Blessed are the poor, for yours is the kingdom of heaven." But this is not the social gospel of later Christianity. It is a spiritual teaching about detachment from material concerns that bind the soul to earthly existence. The poverty Thomas advocates is poverty of spirit, the recognition that ultimate reality lies beyond material accumulation. I watch as scribes carefully copy saying after saying, each one a compressed teaching that could support hours of meditation and discussion. Jesus said, "If you bring forth what is within you, what you bring forth will save you. If you do not bring forth what is within you, what you do not bring forth will destroy you." This is Christianity as self-realization rather than external salvation, transformation rather than substitution.
The manuscript's preservation in multiple languages, Greek, Coptic, and fragments in Latin, testifies to its widespread circulation in early Christian communities. Before the Orthodox canon crystallized, Thomas's Gospel was read alongside Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John as an authentic record of Jesus' teachings. Its exclusion from the New Testament represents one of history's most consequential editorial decisions. The sayings that deal with the nature of reality itself reveal the sophisticated philosophical framework underlying Thomas's Christianity. Jesus said, "I am the light that is over all things. I am all. From me all came forth, and to me all attained."
Split a piece of wood, I am there. Lift up the stone, and you will find me there. This is not the incarnational theology of Orthodox Christianity, but a panentheistic vision that sees divine presence permeating all existence. As evening falls over the phantom scriptorium where Thomas's gospel takes shape, I realize that this text preserves a memory of Christianity before it became a religion of salvation through Christ's death. The Jesus of Thomas saves not by dying, but by teaching, not through substitutionary atonement, but through the communication of gnosis that awakens the divine spark within human consciousness. The tragedy of Thomas's suppression lies not just in the loss of these specific teachings, but in the narrowing of Christian possibility itself. A Christianity that emphasized inner transformation over external ritual, direct spiritual experience over institutional mediation, the authority of gnosis over the authority of office, might have developed into something radically different from the hierarchical, doctrine-centered religion that emerged from the 4th century councils. Standing among these phantom scribes as they preserve Jesus' secret sayings, I understand that Thomas's gospel represents Christianity's mystical heart, the recognition that the kingdom of heaven lies not in some distant future or otherworldly realm, but within the depths of human consciousness, accessible to all who have eyes to see and ears to hear.
The marble halls of Nicaea echo with the sound of sandaled feet and heated theological debate, as 300 bishops from across the Roman Empire gathered to determine the future of Christian doctrine. I walk among these phantom figures in the year 325 CE, feeling the weight of decisions that will reshape Christianity forever, while in distant caves and hidden libraries, alternative gospels burn in fires lit by Orthodox zeal. Emperor Constantine, resplendent in purple robes that catch the morning light streaming through high windows, surveys the assembled bishops with the calculating gaze of a politician who understands that religious unity serves imperial stability. He has not convened this council to discover truth, but to impose it, to end the theological controversies that threaten to tear his newly Christian empire apart. The diversity of early Christianity, which once flourished like a garden of different flowers, must be pruned into a single, manageable orthodoxy. Bishop Hosius of Córdoba, Constantine's personal theological advisor, reads the imperial agenda with the authority of one who speaks for Caesar himself. The primary target is Arianism, the teaching that Christ is subordinate to the Father. But the council's work will extend far beyond this single controversy. Lists of approved and forbidden texts circulate among the bishops, and I see the names of gospels that have nourished Christian communities for centuries now marked for destruction. The Gospel of Thomas, with its emphasis on finding the kingdom within oneself, is condemned as promoting spiritual pride. The Gospel of Mary Magdalene, with its vision of feminine spiritual authority, is rejected as contrary to apostolic tradition. The Gospel of Philip, with its mystical understanding of sacred marriage, is denounced as encouraging libertine behavior. One by one, the alternative voices of early Christianity are silenced by episcopal decree. I observe Bishop Athanasius of Alexandria, the brilliant theologian who will become orthodoxy's greatest champion, as he argues passionately for a narrow definition of acceptable Christian texts. His logic is impeccable from an institutional perspective. If Christianity is to serve as the empire's unifying religion,
It cannot tolerate the kind of theological diversity that has characterized its first 3 centuries. The mystical Gospels, with their emphasis on personal revelation over institutional authority, pose a direct threat to episcopal power.
The theological debates that fill these marble halls reveal the profound differences between Orthodox and Gnostic Christianity. Where the Gnostics see salvation as the awakening of divine consciousness within the human soul, the Orthodox bishops insist on salvation through Christ's atoning death. Where the Gnostics emphasize the authority of personal spiritual experience, the Orthodox demand submission to apostolic tradition as interpreted by bishops. Where the Gnostics celebrate theological diversity, the Orthodox require doctrinal uniformity. The Nicene Creed, hammered out through days of intense negotiation, represents more than a statement of faith. It is a weapon designed to exclude alternative Christianities. Its carefully crafted phrases about Christ being true God and true man, begotten, not made, of one substance with the Father, are specifically formulated to condemn Gnostic teachings about Jesus as a divine revealer rather than a divine sacrifice. I watch as messengers carry the Council's decisions to Christian communities across the empire, bearing not just theological pronouncements, but practical instructions for the destruction of forbidden texts. In Alexandria, Bishop Athanasius issues his famous festal letter of 367 CE, listing the 27 books that will comprise the New Testament canon and explicitly forbidding the reading of apocryphal works that have been cherished by Christian communities for generations. The human cost of these decisions becomes clear as I observe their implementation in distant provinces. In Egypt, monks who have preserved Gnostic texts for centuries face an agonizing choice: burn their sacred books or face excommunication and persecution. Many choose a third option, burying their manuscripts in clay jars and hiding them in desert caves, hoping that future generations might prove more tolerant of theological diversity. The monastery of St. Pachomius near Nag Hammadi becomes a scene of particular tragedy as monks reluctantly consign centuries of alternative Christian literature to the flames. Brother Theodore, an elderly monk who has spent his life copying and studying these texts, weeps openly as he watches the gospel of truth burn. "We are destroying the very diversity that made Christianity beautiful," he whispers to a younger monk who nods in silent agreement. Yet the Council's work is not entirely destructive. The bishops who gather at Nicaea are not motivated by malice, but by a genuine desire to preserve what they believe to be authentic Christian teaching. Their concern is that the proliferation of alternative gospels and competing interpretations threatens to fragment Christianity beyond recognition, leaving believers confused about fundamental questions of faith and practice.
The political dimensions of the Council's decisions cannot be ignored. Constantine needs a unified church to serve his imperial purposes, and theological diversity undermines political stability. The emperor's support for Orthodox Christianity is not primarily religious but pragmatic. He recognizes that a hierarchical, doctrinally unified church will serve imperial interests better than the loose confederation of diverse communities that characterized early Christianity. I observe the careful process by which the bishops justify their exclusion of alternative gospels. They develop criteria for canonical acceptance: apostolic authorship, orthodox content, widespread acceptance, and liturgical use. By these standards, many of the Gnostic texts fail on multiple counts. They are attributed to figures like Thomas and Mary Magdalene rather than the 12 apostles.
They contain teachings that contradict emerging orthodoxy. They are used primarily by communities that bishops consider heretical. The irony of the situation is profound. The bishops who claim to preserve apostolic tradition are actually creating it, defining, for the first time in Christian history, what constitutes authentic apostolic teaching. The diversity that characterized Christianity's first 3 centuries is retroactively declared inauthentic, while the narrow orthodoxy emerging from 4th century councils is presented as the faith once delivered to the saints. As the council concludes and the bishops return to their dioceses armed with imperial authority to enforce their decisions, I realize that we are witnessing one of history's great turning points. The Christianity that emerges from Nicaea will be more unified but less diverse, more institutionally powerful but less mystically rich, more doctrinally precise but less spiritually adventurous. The alternative gospels that burn in the fires of orthodox zeal carry with them not just different texts, but different possibilities for what Christianity might have become. Their destruction represents the closing of doors that will not be reopened for 16 centuries, the silencing of voices that will not be heard again until archaeologists uncover their hidden manuscripts in the Egyptian desert. Standing in the phantom halls of Nicaea, as the bishops disperse to implement their momentous decisions, I understand that this council marks the end of Christianity's childhood and the beginning of its institutional maturity, a maturity purchased at the cost of the theological creativity and spiritual diversity that had characterized its earliest centuries.
The desert silence of Upper Egypt holds secrets that will sleep for 13 centuries, buried beneath sand and stone in clay jars that preserve Christianity's forbidden memory. I stand beside the cliffs of Jabal el-Tarif near the village of Nag Hammadi in December 1945, watching as a Bedouin farmer named Muhammad Ali al-Saman strikes his mattock against what he believes to be a boulder, only to discover a sealed jar that will revolutionize our understanding of early Christian diversity. The moment of discovery unfolds like a scene from ancient prophecy. Muhammad Ali hesitates before breaking the jar, fearing it might contain a jinn that could bring misfortune to his family. But poverty overcomes superstition, and his mattock shatters the clay seal that has protected these manuscripts since the 4th century. Golden papyrus fragments scatter in the desert wind like leaves from a tree of forbidden knowledge, each page containing words that Orthodox Christianity thought it had successfully erased from history. I observe the careful way these ancient manuscripts were prepared for their long sleep. Coptic monks, faced with imperial orders to destroy their heretical texts, chose preservation over obedience. They wrapped each codex in leather covers, placed them in sealed jars, and buried them in the dry Egyptian climate that would prove more faithful to Christian diversity than the Church itself. 13 leather-bound books containing 52 separate texts, Gospels, Apocrypha, prayers, and philosophical treatises that present Christianity in forms that would astonish modern believers. The Gospel of Thomas emerges from its clay tomb like Lazarus from his grave,
Its 114 sayings of Jesus, preserved in Coptic translation from the original Greek. But Thomas is not alone. The Nag Hammadi library contains an entire alternative New Testament that tells the Christian story in radically different ways. The Gospel of Philip speaks of Jesus' intimate relationship with Mary Magdalene. The Apocryphon of John presents a complex cosmology that explains the origin of evil without blaming human sin. The Gospel of Truth offers a mystical meditation on the nature of salvation that emphasizes knowledge over faith. Brother Pachomius, the phantom figure of the monk who likely supervised the burial of these texts, moves through the desert landscape with the measured pace of someone carrying an enormous burden. His monastery, located just a few miles from the burial site, had been home to one of Egypt's most important collections of alternative Christian literature. When Athanasius's festal letter of 367 CE demanded the destruction of non-canonical texts, Pachomius faced an impossible choice: obey his bishop or preserve the spiritual heritage of his community.
The decision to bury rather than burn these manuscripts represents one of history's most consequential acts of civil disobedience. These monks understood that they were preserving not just books, but entire ways of understanding Christianity that might prove valuable to future generations. Their act of preservation was also an act of faith that someday the Church might be mature enough to embrace the theological diversity that characterized its earliest centuries. I examined the physical evidence of the manuscript's careful preparation for burial. Each codex was wrapped in protective leather, some bearing the names of their original owners. The Gospel of Thomas bears the inscription, "According to Thomas," while the Gospel of Philip is marked with symbols that suggest it was used in liturgical worship. These were not academic curiosities, but living texts that nourished the spiritual lives of Christian communities that Orthodox history has forgotten. The theological treasures contained in these buried codices challenge every assumption about early Christian uniformity. The prayer of the Apostle Paul presents a mystical approach to prayer that emphasizes union with the divine rather than petition for divine favor. The dialogue of the Savior records conversations between Jesus and his disciples that focus on cosmological mysteries rather than moral instruction. The Thunder Perfect Mind presents the divine feminine speaking in paradoxes that celebrate the complexity of spiritual truth. The preservation of these texts, in Coptic rather than Greek, reveals the international character of early Christian diversity. Egypt's Christian communities developed their own theological traditions, their own interpretations of Jesus' message, their own practices of worship and spiritual discipline. The Nag Hammadi library preserves this indigenous Egyptian Christianity that flourished before Orthodox uniformity was imposed from Constantinople and Rome. I observed the careful way these manuscripts were copied and preserved by communities that understood their dangerous nature. Many texts contain warnings about sharing their contents with the uninitiated. The Apocryphon of James begins with the instruction that its teachings should be revealed only to those who are spiritually prepared to receive them. This emphasis on esoteric knowledge reflects the Gnostic understanding that spiritual truth cannot be mass-produced, but must be individually discovered through personal revelation. The variety of texts in the Nag Hammadi collection
reveals the rich diversity of early Christian thought. Alongside Gospels and Apocalypses, the library contains philosophical treatises like the Teachings of Sylvanus, which blends Christian themes with Platonic philosophy, and the Sentences of Sextus, which presents ethical instruction in the form of wisdom sayings. This diversity suggests that early Christian communities were comfortable with theological pluralism in ways that later orthodoxy would find threatening. The physical condition of the manuscripts when they were discovered testifies to both the care with which they were preserved and the violence they suffered before burial. Some codices show signs of deliberate mutilation, pages torn out, passages scratched away, entire sections removed. These scars suggest that even within the communities that preserved them, these texts were controversial, their contents too dangerous for some believers to tolerate. The irony of the Nag Hammadi discovery is profound. These texts, buried to escape destruction by Orthodox Christianity, were preserved by the very desert that had nurtured Christian monasticism. The dry Egyptian climate that allowed hermits and monks to pursue their spiritual disciplines also protected the manuscripts that recorded alternative approaches to Christian spirituality. The desert became both the graveyard and the guardian of Christianity's suppressed diversity. As I stand in the phantom excavation site where these treasures were unearthed, I realize that the Nag Hammadi discovery represents more than an archaeological find. It is a resurrection of voices that Orthodox Christianity thought it had silenced forever. These buried Gospels speak across 13 centuries to remind us that Christianity was once more diverse, more mystical, more open to alternative interpretations than institutional memory suggests. The clay jars that protected these manuscripts through the long centuries of their burial serve as a metaphor for the preservation of spiritual truth itself. Like seeds that can lie dormant for decades before sprouting when conditions are right, these alternative Gospels waited in their desert tomb until the modern world was ready to hear their message of theological diversity and spiritual freedom. Standing among the phantom figures of the monks who buried these texts, I understand that their act of preservation was also an act of prophecy, a faith that future generations might prove more tolerant of Christian diversity than their own age had been.
In the shadows of a cave near Elmina, Egypt, where desert winds have carved secrets into limestone walls, I discover the most controversial gospel of all. A text that transforms history's greatest villain into its most beloved disciple. The Gospel of Judas, preserved in Coptic on papyrus that crumbles at the touch of desert air, presents a story so radical that it inverts the very foundation of Christian salvation. What if the betrayer was actually the most faithful apostle, chosen by Jesus himself to perform the act that would make redemption possible? The manuscript rests in my phantom hands like a whispered heresy made tangible, its pages bearing witness to a Christianity that Orthodox believers would find not just wrong, but blasphemous. Written in the 2nd century by Gnostic Christians who saw betrayal as obedience, crucifixion as liberation, and Judas Iscariot as the only disciple who truly understood Jesus' mission,
This gospel challenges 2 millennia of Christian teaching about good and evil, salvation and damnation. I observe the careful way this text was hidden, not just from Roman persecution, but from other Christians who would have found its message intolerable. Even among the diverse communities of early Christianity, the Gospel of Judas represented an extreme position, a theological speculation so radical that it could only be preserved in the most secret circles, copied by scribes who understood they were preserving dynamite disguised as scripture. The opening lines strike like lightning across conventional Christian understanding. The secret account of the revelation that Jesus spoke in conversation with Judas Iscariot during a week 3 days before he celebrated Passover. This is not the Judas of Orthodox tradition, the greedy betrayer motivated by 30 pieces of silver, but a figure of cosmic significance, chosen by Jesus to play the most crucial role in the drama of salvation. Brother Cainites, the phantom figure of the Gnostic sect that preserved this gospel, moves through the Egyptian desert with the furtive manner of someone carrying dangerous knowledge. His community believes that the God of the Old Testament is not the true divine being, but a lesser deity, the demiurge, who created the material world as a prison for divine sparks trapped in human bodies. In this cosmology, those who oppose the demiurge's will are actually serving the true God, making Cain, the Sodomites, and Judas Iscariot heroes rather than villains. The theological revolution contained in this gospel cannot be overstated. Where Orthodox Christianity sees Jesus' death as a sacrifice for human sin, the Gospel of Judas presents it as the liberation of Jesus' divine spirit from its material prison. Judas becomes not the betrayer, but the liberator, not the villain, but the hero, not the damned, but the most blessed of all the apostles, because he alone understood what Jesus truly wanted.
I watch the phantom scene unfold as Jesus takes Judas aside from the other disciples and reveals to him alone the deepest mysteries of existence. Step away from the others, and I shall tell you the mysteries of the kingdom. It is possible for you to reach it, but you will grieve a great deal. This is not the Jesus of Orthodox theology, dying for humanity's sins, but the Jesus of Gnostic understanding, seeking escape from material existence. The other disciples in this gospel are portrayed not as faithful followers, but as deluded worshippers who mistake the demiurge for the true God. When they describe their vision of the temple where they serve as priests, Jesus laughs at their ignorance. You are the priests serving at the altar you have seen. That is the God you serve, and you are those 12 men you have seen. The cattle you have seen brought for sacrifice are the many people you lead astray before that altar. The manuscript's treatment of sacrifice and salvation proves equally revolutionary. Where Orthodox Christianity will develop elaborate theories of substitutionary atonement, Christ dying in humanity's place to satisfy divine justice, the Gospel of Judas presents Jesus' death as the necessary destruction of his material body to free his divine spirit. Judas performs the service not out of greed or betrayal, but out of love and understanding. The cosmic mythology underlying this gospel draws on ancient Gnostic traditions that see the material world as fundamentally flawed. The true God exists beyond the physical universe, which was created by the demiurge as a trap for divine souls.
Salvation comes not through faith in Christ's atoning death, but through gnosis, the knowledge that allows the divine spark within each person to escape its material prison and return to its true home. I observe the careful way this text handles the relationship between Jesus and Judas, presenting them not as master and betrayer, but as co-conspirators in a cosmic plan that the other disciples cannot understand. "You will exceed all of them," Jesus tells Judas, "for you will sacrifice the man that clothes me." This is not betrayal, but the ultimate act of discipleship, performed by the only apostle who truly comprehends Jesus' mission. The Gospel of Judas also presents a radically different understanding of martyrdom and persecution. Where Orthodox Christianity will celebrate those who die for their faith, this text suggests that such deaths serve the demiurge's purposes by keeping divine souls trapped in cycles of material existence. True salvation comes not through dying for Christ, but through understanding the illusory nature of material reality.
The manuscript's preservation in Coptic rather than Greek suggests that it circulated primarily among Egyptian Christian communities that were already comfortable with alternative interpretations of Jesus' message. These communities, influenced by ancient Egyptian religious traditions that emphasized the soul's journey through death to divine reunion, found the Gospel of Judas's message more comprehensible than Orthodox believers in other parts of the empire. The theological implications of this gospel extend far beyond the figure of Judas himself. If the betrayer was actually the most faithful disciple, if the crucifixion was liberation rather than sacrifice, if the material world is a prison rather than God's good creation, then virtually every aspect of Orthodox Christian teaching requires fundamental reconsideration. As I stand in the phantom cave where this dangerous gospel was preserved, I realize that the Gospel of Judas represents the most extreme expression of early Christian diversity, a text so radical that even other alternative Christians found it difficult to accept. Its preservation testifies to the extraordinary theological creativity of early Christian communities and their willingness to explore even the most challenging implications of their faith. The tragedy of this gospel's suppression lies not just in the loss of an alternative perspective on Judas, but in the narrowing of Christian imagination itself. A faith that could once contemplate such radical reinterpretations of its foundational stories was capable of extraordinary theological creativity. The silencing of such voices impoverished Christianity's capacity for self-examination and renewal. Standing among the phantom scribes who preserved this most controversial of gospels, I understand that the Gospel of Judas challenges us to question our most basic assumptions about good and evil, faithfulness and betrayal, salvation and damnation, questions that Orthodox Christianity has preferred to avoid, but that remain as relevant today as they were in the 2nd century. In the sacred chambers where early Christian mystics gathered to celebrate the divine feminine, I witnessed the systematic suppression of Sophia, wisdom herself, as patriarchal Christianity transforms the goddess into a footnote and sacred marriage into heresy. The candlelight flickers across manuscripts that speak of the divine as both male and female, of salvation through the reunion of opposites, of a Christianity that honored the feminine principle as equal partner in the cosmic dance of creation and redemption. The Gospel of Philip, preserved among the Nag Hammadi texts, presents a vision of Christianity that would horrify later church fathers with its celebration of sacred sexuality and divine femininity. The companion of the Savior is Mary Magdalene. Christ loved her more than all the disciples and used to kiss her often on her mouth. But this is not scandal, it is sacrament, the earthly reflection of the cosmic marriage between Christ and his divine bride, Sophia, that restores the primordial unity shattered by the fall into duality. I observe Sister Marcella, a Valentinian teacher, whose very existence as a female spiritual authority challenges the emerging patriarchal order, as she instructs her community in the mysteries of the bridal chamber, the highest sacrament of Gnostic Christianity. In her understanding, salvation comes not through Christ's death, but through the sacred reunion of masculine and feminine principles, both within the individual soul and in the cosmic order itself. The theological framework underlying this feminine Christianity draws on ancient wisdom traditions that personify divine wisdom as a female figure, Sophia in Greek, Hokmah in Hebrew, Isis in Egyptian religion. These traditions saw the feminine principle as essential to creation, the divine mother who gives birth to the cosmos, the wise counselor who guides souls back to their divine source. Early Christian communities, especially in Egypt and Syria, incorporated these traditions into their understanding of Jesus' message. The Apocryphon of John, another Nag Hammadi text, presents an elaborate cosmology in which Sophia plays a central role in both the creation and redemption of the world. She is the divine wisdom who emanates from the Father, the feminine aspect of divinity who seeks to know the unknowable, and in doing so brings forth the material universe. Her story becomes the story of every soul's journey from divine unity through material exile to spiritual return. I watch the phantom rituals of these early Christian communities as they celebrate the sacred marriage between Christ and Sophia, between the divine masculine and feminine principles. Their worship includes both men and women as equals. Their prayers invoke the Divine Mother alongside the Divine Father. Their sacraments celebrate the body as the temple of divine presence, rather than condemning it as the source of sin.
The Gospel of Mary Magdalene presents the most direct challenge to patriarchal Christianity's suppression of feminine spiritual authority. When Peter objects to Mary's teaching, saying, "Did he really speak privately with a woman and not openly to us? Are we to turn about and all listen to her? Did he prefer her to us?" He voices the anxiety that will drive centuries of systematic exclusion of women from positions of religious authority. The Thunder, Perfect Mind, a remarkable text that presents the divine feminine speaking in her own voice, celebrates the paradoxical nature of divine wisdom. I am the first and the last. I am the honored one and the scorned one. I am the whore and the holy one. I am the wife and the virgin. I am the mother and the daughter. This is divinity that transcends the categories that patriarchal thinking uses to control and diminish feminine power. The suppression of these feminine voices begins early in Christian history, but accelerates dramatically after Constantine's conversion. The Council of Nicaea, focused on establishing doctrinal uniformity, has no place for the theological diversity that allowed feminine imagery and authority to flourish. The bishops who gather there are exclusively male, representing churches that have already begun excluding women from leadership roles. I observe the careful process by which Orthodox Christianity transforms the divine feminine from partner to subordinate. Sophia, once celebrated as the divine wisdom through whom all things were made, becomes merely an attribute of the male god rather than a divine person in her own right. Mary Magdalene, once honored as the apostle to the apostles, is transformed into a repentant prostitute whose only significance lies in her submission to male authority. The theological implications of this suppression extend far beyond gender politics. By eliminating the feminine principle from divinity, Orthodox Christianity creates a theological system that is fundamentally unbalanced, emphasizing transcendence over immanence, spirit over matter, hierarchy over equality, authority over relationship. The rich symbolism of sacred marriage, which represented the soul's union with the divine, is replaced by the imagery of submission and obedience. The economic and social consequences of suppressing feminine Christianity prove equally significant. Communities that honored women's spiritual authority often practiced economic equality as well, sharing resources and making decisions collectively. The patriarchal Christianity that emerges from the 4th century councils supports hierarchical social structures that concentrate power in the hands of male clergy and wealthy patrons.
I watch as manuscripts containing feminine Christian wisdom are systematically destroyed or hidden away. The Gospel of Mary disappears from circulation, surviving only in fragmentary copies. The Thunder, Perfect Mind is preserved only because it was buried with other heretical texts at Nag Hammadi. The rich tradition of feminine Christian mysticism goes underground, surviving in secret communities and coded texts that will not resurface for centuries. The transformation of Mary Magdalene from apostle to penitent prostitute represents the most successful character assassination in Christian history. Pope Gregory the Great's conflation of Mary Magdalene with the unnamed sinful woman who anoints Jesus' feet creates a new narrative that serves patriarchal interests perfectly. The most prominent female disciple becomes an example of feminine sinfulness redeemed through submission to male authority. The monastic movement, which might have preserved feminine spiritual authority through communities of religious women, instead reinforces patriarchal control by requiring female monastics to submit to male ecclesiastical authority. Even the most accomplished abbesses must defer to bishops and priests, their spiritual insights filtered through male interpretation and approval. As I stand in the phantom chambers where feminine Christianity once flourished, I realize that the suppression of the divine feminine represents more than the loss of alternative texts or practices. It marks the impoverishment of Christian imagination itself. A faith that could once celebrate the divine as both father and mother, that could honor both masculine and feminine approaches to spirituality, that could see salvation as the reunion of opposites rather than the triumph of one over the other, possessed resources for understanding human experience that Orthodox Christianity deliberately abandoned. The sacred marriage that these early Christians celebrated, the union of Christ and Sophia, of masculine and feminine principles, of heaven and earth, offered a vision of salvation that was cosmic in scope and deeply personal in application. Its suppression left Christianity with a truncated understanding of both divinity and humanity,
an understanding that continues to impoverish Christian spirituality to this day. Standing among the phantom figures of these early Christian feminists, I understand that their suppressed wisdom speaks across the centuries to remind us of possibilities that Orthodox Christianity chose to abandon, but that remain as relevant today as they were in the 2nd century.
The desert monasteries of Egypt stretch across the landscape like islands of contemplation in an ocean of sand, their mud-brick walls sheltering secrets that Rome would rather forget. I walk through the phantom corridors of the monastery of St. Anthony, where Coptic monks have spent centuries preserving the theological diversity that Orthodox Christianity sought to eliminate, their libraries hidden behind false walls and buried beneath chapel floors. Brother Shenote, the abbot whose fierce independence has made him a legend throughout Christian Egypt, moves through his monastery's secret archive with the careful steps of someone who understands that knowledge can be more dangerous than any physical weapon. His community has chosen preservation over obedience, maintaining collections of alternative gospels and Gnostic texts despite repeated orders from Alexandria's patriarch to destroy such heretical materials. The theological justification for this act of ecclesiastical disobedience runs deep in Egyptian Christian tradition. These monks see themselves as guardians of the full spectrum of early Christian thought, preserving not just orthodox texts, but the alternative voices that provide context and contrast. How can we understand the light, Brother Shenote asks his community, if we destroy all record of the darkness it was meant to illuminate? I observe the careful rituals by which these dangerous texts are preserved and studied. Access is restricted to senior monks who have demonstrated both theological sophistication and absolute discretion. The manuscripts are copied in secret, often during the deep hours of night when the desert silence provides cover for activities that could bring persecution from church authorities. Each text is wrapped in protective cloth and stored in sealed containers that protect against both moisture and discovery. The Gospel of Thomas circulates among these communities not as heretical literature, but as a valuable record of early Christian diversity. The monks study its sayings alongside the canonical Gospels, finding in its emphasis on inner transformation a complement to orthodox teachings about external salvation. They see no contradiction between honoring church authority and preserving alternative perspectives that might prove valuable to future generations. The monastery's library contains treasures that would astonish scholars in Constantinople or Rome. The complete Gospel of Mary Magdalene rests beside commentaries written by Egyptian theologians who saw no conflict between honoring feminine spiritual authority and maintaining orthodox Christology. The Apocryphon of John is studied not as dangerous heresy, but as an example of early Christian cosmological speculation that helps illuminate the development of orthodox doctrine. I watch Brother Pachomius the Younger, descendant of the great monastic founder, as he instructs novice monks in the proper approach to alternative Christian texts. These writings contain errors, he acknowledges, but they also contain insights that Orthodox theology has sometimes overlooked. We preserve them not because we agree with everything they teach, but because the Church's understanding of truth is enriched by encountering alternative perspectives. The theological sophistication of these Egyptian monks proves remarkable. They have developed hermeneutical principles for reading Gnostic texts that allow them to extract valuable insights while rejecting dangerous doctrines. They study the Gospel of Philip's teachings about sacred marriage not as literal instruction, but as symbolic representation of the soul's union with Christ. They read the Gospel of Judas not as historical fact, but as theological speculation about the nature of divine providence. The economic independence of these desert monasteries provides crucial protection for their preservation activities. Unlike urban churches that depend on imperial patronage and episcopal approval, these communities support themselves through agriculture, crafts, and the copying of manuscripts for sale to collectors throughout the Mediterranean world. This economic autonomy allows them to resist pressure from church authorities who would prefer to see alternative texts destroyed. The social structure of Egyptian monasticism also facilitates the preservation of theological diversity. These communities operate with a degree of democratic participation that is rare in the increasingly hierarchical church of the 4th and 5th centuries. Decisions about which texts to preserve and study are made collectively, with senior monks drawing on centuries of accumulated wisdom about the value of maintaining diverse perspectives. I observe the careful way these monks balance preservation with discretion. They maintain public libraries that contain only Orthodox texts, while their secret collections remain hidden from visiting bishops and imperial inspectors. They participate fully in the liturgical life of the Orthodox Church while privately studying texts that official Christianity has condemned. This double life requires extraordinary discipline and theological sophistication. The correspondence between Egyptian monasteries reveals a network of communities committed to preserving Christian diversity. Letters written in coded language discuss the transfer of manuscripts, the training of scribes, and the development of hiding places that can protect dangerous texts from periodic purges. This underground railroad of alternative Christianity operates across the entire eastern Mediterranean, connecting communities from Syria to Nubia.
The theological debates that take place in these hidden chambers prove as sophisticated as any conducted in the great theological schools of the empire. Monks argue about the proper interpretation of Gnostic cosmology, the historical value of alternative gospels, and the relationship between mystical experience and orthodox doctrine. These discussions, conducted in Coptic rather than Greek, develop indigenous Egyptian approaches to Christian theology that will influence the region's religious life for centuries. The preservation efforts of these monasteries extend beyond texts to include oral traditions, liturgical practices, and spiritual disciplines that Orthodox Christianity has abandoned or suppressed. They maintain meditation techniques derived from Gnostic spirituality, preserve hymns that celebrate the divine feminine, and practice forms of contemplative prayer that emphasize direct spiritual experience over institutional mediation. I watch as young monks learn the ancient art of manuscript preservation, studying not just copying techniques, but the chemistry of inks and papyrus, the construction of protective containers, and the selection of hiding places that will protect texts through centuries of potential persecution. This knowledge, passed down through generations of monastic communities, represents one of history's most successful preservation efforts. The irony of the situation is profound. The same monastic movement that Orthodox Christianity celebrates as the triumph of ascetic spirituality
also serves as the primary means of preserving the alternative Christian traditions that orthodoxy sought to eliminate. The desert that nurtured Orthodox saints also sheltered heretical texts. The monasteries that produced Orthodox theologians also preserved Gnostic Gospels. As evening falls over the phantom monastery and the monks gather for their final prayers of the day, I realize that these communities represent Christianity's unconscious memory, the preservation of alternatives that the conscious church rejected, but that the deeper wisdom of the tradition recognized as valuable. Their secret libraries serve as repositories not just of texts, but of possibilities, preserving alternative visions of what Christianity might have become. Standing among these phantom monks as they continue their dangerous work of preservation, I understand that their efforts represent more than historical curiosity. They maintain the genetic diversity that allows religious traditions to adapt and evolve, preserving resources that future generations might need to address challenges that the present cannot anticipate.
The 20th century dawns with archaeological discoveries that will shatter 16 centuries of Orthodox certainty about early Christian history. I stand beside the phantom figures of scholars and archaeologists as they uncover manuscript after manuscript that reveals the extraordinary diversity of Christianity's earliest centuries. Each papyrus fragment challenging assumptions that have shaped Western civilization since the Council of Nicaea. The first tremor comes in 1896 when British archaeologists working in Oxyrhynchus, Egypt, discover fragments of what will later be identified as the Gospel of Thomas. The Greek papyrus dating to around 200 CE contains sayings of Jesus that appear in no canonical gospel, including the mysterious opening, "These are the secret sayings which the living Jesus spoke and which Didymos Judas Thomas wrote down." The scholarly world reacts with a mixture of excitement and skepticism. Could there really be authentic sayings of Jesus that the Church had forgotten? Dr. Bernard Grenfell and Dr. Arthur Hunt, the Oxford scholars who make this initial discovery, work with the careful precision of archaeologists who understand they are handling dynamite disguised as ancient papyrus. Their publication of the Oxyrhynchus sayings of Jesus creates a sensation in academic circles, but the fragments are too incomplete to reveal the full scope of alternative Christian tradition that lies buried beneath Egyptian sands. The real revolution begins in December 1945, when Muhammad Ali al-Saman's mattock strikes the clay jar near Nag Hammadi that contains 13 leather-bound codices, an entire library of alternative Christian texts that Orthodox Christianity thought it had successfully destroyed. I observe the complex journey these manuscripts take from their discovery to scholarly publication, a process that reveals as much about modern academic politics as about ancient religious diversity. The manuscripts initially disappear into Egypt's antiquities black market, where dealers and collectors recognize their potential value without understanding their revolutionary content. The Coptic Museum in Cairo acquires most of the collection, but political tensions between Egypt and the West complicate scholarly access. It will take decades before the full contents of the Nag Hammadi library become available to researchers, and even longer before their implications are fully understood. Professor James Robinson of Claremont Graduate School emerges as the hero of this scholarly detective story, spending years tracking down scattered fragments, negotiating with Egyptian authorities, and coordinating the international team of scholars needed to translate and interpret these ancient texts. His work represents one of the 20th century's greatest achievements in religious scholarship, comparable to the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls in its impact on our understanding of ancient religious diversity.
I watch the painstaking process by which these fragile manuscripts are conserved, photographed, and translated. Each page requires careful treatment to prevent further deterioration. Each word demands scholarly debate about proper interpretation. Each text challenges fundamental assumptions about early Christian history. The Gospel of Thomas, now complete rather than fragmentary, reveals a Jesus who teaches salvation through self-knowledge rather than sacrificial death. The Gospel of Philip presents a Christianity that celebrates sacred sexuality rather than condemning it. The Gospel of Mary Magdalene shows a female apostle whose authority rivals that of Peter himself. The academic establishment's reaction to these discoveries proves as revealing as the texts themselves. Conservative scholars, trained in traditional approaches to Christian history, struggle to incorporate evidence that contradicts centuries of orthodox interpretation. Liberal scholars embrace the new texts as proof that early Christianity was more diverse and less institutionally controlled than previously believed. The debates that ensue in academic journals and scholarly conferences echo the theological controversies of the 2nd and 3rd centuries. Dr. Elaine Pagels, whose groundbreaking work, The Gnostic Gospels, brings these discoveries to popular attention, faces both acclaim and criticism for her interpretation of their significance. Her argument that these texts preserve authentic early Christian traditions that were suppressed for political rather than theological reasons challenges not just academic orthodoxy, but the self-understanding of modern Christianity itself. The technological advances of the late 20th century accelerate the pace of discovery and interpretation. Decuter databases allow scholars to compare texts across different manuscripts. Digital photography preserves fragile papyri that might otherwise crumble, and international collaboration becomes possible through electronic communication. The Internet democratizes access to these ancient texts, making them available to anyone with curiosity about Christianity's suppressed history. I observe the discovery of additional manuscripts that continue to expand our understanding of early Christian diversity. The Gospel of Judas, found in the 1970s but not published until 2006, presents the most radical reinterpretation of Christian origins yet discovered. The Gospel of Jesus' wife, announced in 2012, though later questioned, suggests that debates about Jesus' marital status were more complex than Orthodox tradition admits.
The archaeological context of these discoveries proves as important as their content. The fact that these texts were buried rather than burned suggests that even within communities that officially accepted Orthodox Christianity, there remained appreciation for alternative perspectives. The careful preservation of these manuscripts in sealed jars demonstrates sophisticated understanding of conservation techniques that allowed them to survive 16 centuries in the Egyptian desert. The scholarly apparatus that develops around these discoveries creates new academic disciplines and research methodologies. Coptic studies experiences a renaissance as scholars recognize the importance of Egyptian Christianity in preserving early Christian diversity. Gender studies and religion emerges partly in response to texts like the Gospel of Mary that challenge traditional assumptions about women's roles in early Christianity. The study of Gnosticism evolves from a minor academic specialty to a major field of religious scholarship. The popular impact of these discoveries extends far beyond academic circles. Dan Brown's The Da Vinci Code, while historically inaccurate in many details, introduces millions of readers to the possibility that early Christianity was more diverse than they had been taught. Documentary films, popular books, and internet discussions bring these ancient texts to audiences that previous generations of scholars could never have reached. The theological implications of these discoveries continue to reverberate through modern Christianity. Progressive Christians embrace these texts as evidence for more inclusive, less hierarchical approaches to faith.
Conservative Christians argue that their late discovery and heretical content prove their inauthenticity. The debates echo ancient controversies about authority, interpretation, and the boundaries of acceptable Christian belief. As I stand among the phantom figures of 20th century scholars who dedicated their lives to recovering Christianity's lost voices, I realize that their work represents more than historical curiosity. These discoveries challenge every generation to reconsider what they think they know about the origins of their faith, to acknowledge the complexity and diversity that Orthodox tradition has simplified and suppressed. The manuscripts that sleep for 16 centuries beneath Egyptian sands carry within them not just alternative texts, but alternative possibilities for what Christianity might become. Their resurrection in the 20th century offers modern believers the opportunity to encounter their faith's suppressed memory and to consider whether the roads not taken in early Christian history might still offer valuable insights for contemporary spiritual seekers.
The lecture halls of Harvard, Princeton, and Oxford echo with voices that have been silent for 16 centuries as scholars translate, interpret, and debate the significance of Christianity's recovered memory. I walk through phantom seminars where the Gospel of Thomas is studied alongside Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, where the Gospel of Mary Magdalene challenges assumptions about apostolic authority, where the very foundations of Christian orthodoxy tremble under the weight of archaeological evidence. Professor Karen King stands before her Harvard Divinity School students holding a fragment of papyrus that contains the phrase, "Jesus said to them, 'My wife.'" The gospel of Jesus' wife, as it comes to be known, ignites a firestorm of scholarly debate and popular controversy. Though later questioned for authenticity, its very existence forces uncomfortable questions about what early Christians believed regarding Jesus' marital status and the role of women in his inner circle. The transformation of academic biblical studies proves as revolutionary as the discoveries themselves. Where once scholars worked primarily with canonical texts, assuming their priority and authenticity, now they must grapple with a much more complex picture of early Christian diversity. The neat categories of orthodox and heretical, authentic and spurious, apostolic and post-apostolic dissolve under careful historical analysis. I observe Dr. Bart Ehrman as he explains to his University of North Carolina students how the discovery of alternative gospels has revolutionized our understanding of early Christian history. We used to think that Orthodox Christianity was the original form of the faith, with heresies developing later as corruptions, he tells them. Now we understand that diversity was the original condition, with orthodoxy emerging as one voice among many that eventually gained political power. The methodological implications of these discoveries extend far beyond Christian studies. Scholars develop new approaches to analyzing religious texts that take seriously the possibility that suppressed traditions might preserve authentic historical memories. The study of early Christianity becomes more anthropological, more attentive to issues of power and social construction, more skeptical of claims about original purity and later corruption. The Gospel of Thomas, now available in complete form, challenges fundamental assumptions about the nature of Jesus' teaching. Its emphasis on finding the kingdom of heaven within oneself, its lack of interest in Jesus' death and resurrection, its presentation of salvation as self-knowledge rather than divine grace, forces scholars to reconsider what the historical Jesus might actually have taught.
Dr. Stephen Davies,
whose work on the Gospel of Thomas has been particularly influential, argues that this text may preserve sayings traditions that are actually older than those found in the canonical Gospels. His careful analysis of the text structure and content suggests that it represents an independent stream of Jesus tradition that developed parallel to, rather than dependent on, the canonical Gospels. The feminist implications of these discoveries prove equally revolutionary. The Gospel of Mary Magdalene presents a female apostle whose spiritual authority rivals that of Peter, while the Gospel of Philip speaks of Jesus' intimate relationship with Mary in terms that suggest spiritual partnership rather than mere discipleship. These texts provide historical evidence for women's leadership roles in early Christianity that Orthodox tradition has systematically suppressed. Professor Elaine Pagels, whose popular writings have brought these discoveries to millions of readers, faces both acclaim and criticism for her interpretation of their significance. Conservative scholars argue that she overemphasizes the political dimensions of early Christian conflicts, while progressive scholars sometimes criticize her for not going far enough in challenging Orthodox assumptions. Her work represents the complex negotiations required when academic scholarship encounters deeply held religious beliefs. The technological revolution of the late 20th century and early 21st century democratizes access to these ancient texts in unprecedented ways. Digital libraries make high-resolution photographs of manuscripts available to anyone with internet access. Translation projects put multiple versions of these texts online, allowing readers to compare different scholarly interpretations. Academic conferences are live-streamed, bringing scholarly debates to global audiences. I watch as online communities form around the study of these alternative gospels, creating new forms of religious exploration that bypass traditional ecclesiastical authority. Some groups attempt to reconstruct ancient Gnostic practices based on textual evidence, while others use these discoveries as inspiration for contemporary spiritual innovation. The internet becomes a new kind of desert where alternative Christianities can flourish away from institutional control. The institutional response of established Christianity to these discoveries varies dramatically across denominational lines. The Roman Catholic Church, through its Pontifical Biblical Commission, acknowledges the historical value of these texts while maintaining that they do not challenge fundamental doctrines. Protestant denominations range from enthusiastic embrace to outright rejection, depending on their theological orientation and approach to biblical authority.
The Orthodox churches, particularly those in Egypt and Syria, where many of these texts were originally preserved, show more openness to incorporating insights from alternative gospels into their theological reflection. Their long tradition of mystical theology provides frameworks for understanding Gnostic emphasis on direct spiritual experience, while their historical connection to early Christian diversity makes them less threatened by evidence of theological pluralism. The popular impact of these discoveries extends far beyond academic and ecclesiastical circles. The success of novels like Dan Brown's The Da Vinci Code, despite their historical inaccuracies, demonstrates public hunger for alternative perspectives on Christian origins. Documentary films, popular books, and internet discussions bring these ancient texts to audiences that traditional scholarship could never reach. The emergence of new religious movements inspired by these discoveries
represents one of the most significant developments in contemporary spirituality. Neo-Gnostic groups attempt to reconstruct ancient practices based on textual evidence, while progressive Christian communities incorporate insights from alternative gospels into their worship and theology. These movements represent the contemporary flowering of seeds that were planted in the Egyptian desert 16 centuries ago. The scholarly apparatus that has developed around these texts creates new academic disciplines and research methodologies. Coptic studies experiences a renaissance. Gender studies in religion emerges as a major field, and the study of ancient Christianity becomes more interdisciplinary, drawing on anthropology, sociology, and literary criticism alongside traditional historical and theological methods. As I stand in the phantom lecture halls where these discoveries are debated and interpreted, I realize that the recovery of Christianity's lost gospels represents more than historical curiosity. These texts challenge every generation to reconsider what they think they know about the origins of their faith, to acknowledge the complexity and diversity that Orthodox tradition has simplified and suppressed. The voices that Orthodox Christianity thought it had silenced forever now speak in university classrooms, online forums, and progressive churches around the world. Their message is not necessarily that Orthodox Christianity is wrong, but that it represents one path among many that early Christians explored, one interpretation among many that seemed plausible to ancient believers. Standing among the phantom scholars who have dedicated their lives to recovering these suppressed voices, I understand that their work represents a kind of resurrection, the return to life of possibilities that seemed dead and buried, the recovery of alternatives that Orthodox tradition chose to abandon, but that remain as relevant today as they were in the 2nd century.
The whispers of ancient voices grow softer now as we approach the threshold between waking knowledge and sleeping wisdom, where the lost gospels of Christianity dissolve into the deeper currents of human longing for divine truth. I stand in a phantom library that exists beyond time and space, where all the suppressed texts of early Christianity rest together in eternal peace, their conflicts resolved in the greater harmony of spiritual seeking. The Gospel of Thomas speaks its final saying into the gathering dusk. Whoever finds the interpretation of these sayings will not experience death. But now I understand that death and life, orthodox and heretical, canonical and apocryphal, are merely words we use to divide what was always meant to be whole. The Jesus who taught in parables, who revealed mysteries to those who had ears to hear, who promised that the kingdom of heaven lay within reach of every seeking soul. This Jesus belongs not to any single tradition, but to the universal human quest for meaning and transcendence. Mary Magdalene walks beside me through these phantom halls, no longer the repentant sinner of Orthodox legend, nor the Gnostic apostle of alternative tradition,
but simply a woman who loved deeply and understood profoundly the mystery of divine presence in human form. Her gospel, with its vision of the soul's journey through cosmic spheres, becomes a meditation on the path that every spirit must travel from material entanglement to spiritual freedom. The divine feminine, suppressed for so many centuries, emerges not as competitor to masculine divinity, but as its eternal complement, the Sophia, whose wisdom dances through creation, the sacred bride whose union with the cosmic Christ restores the primordial wholeness that was shattered by the fall into duality. In this twilight realm, all opposites are reconciled, all conflicts resolved in the deeper truth that transcends human categories. The Coptic monks who buried these texts in the Egyptian desert appear as guardians of a treasure that was never meant to remain hidden forever. Their act of preservation becomes an act of faith in humanity's eventual readiness to embrace the full spectrum of spiritual possibility, to move beyond the narrow certainties that divide us toward the broader wisdom that unites us in our common search for the sacred. The scholars who recovered these lost voices in the 20th century fade into the background as their work is completed, their translations and interpretations becoming stepping stones toward a deeper understanding that requires no academic credentials, no institutional authority, no orthodox approval, only the willingness to listen with the heart to truths that speak across the centuries.
The alternative Christianities that these texts preserve begin to merge with the mainstream tradition from which they were separated, like streams that have flowed apart for centuries, finally returning to the ocean that was always their common source. The diversity that once seemed threatening becomes the richness that nourishes. The questions that once seemed dangerous become the inquiries that deepen faith rather than destroying it. In this place beyond time, I see that the real tragedy of the lost Gospels was not their suppression, but the fear that motivated their suppression. The fear that truth is fragile, that faith cannot withstand questioning, that diversity weakens rather than strengthens the human search for meaning. The councils that condemned these texts, the bishops who ordered their destruction, the emperors who enforced orthodoxy, all acted from a kind of spiritual anxiety that mistook control for strength, uniformity for unity. The desert wind that once carried the smoke of burning manuscripts now carries only the scent of jasmine and eternity, the fragrance of wisdom that cannot be destroyed because it lives not in any text, but in the human heart's capacity for wonder, for questioning, for the kind of love that seeks understanding rather than demanding submission. The clay jars that protected these manuscripts through 16 centuries of burial become symbols of patience itself, the recognition that truth has its own timing, that what one generation cannot accept, another may embrace, that the seeds of wisdom can lie dormant for centuries before finding soil ready for their flowering. The internet forums where modern seekers discuss these ancient texts, the progressive churches where their insights are incorporated into contemporary worship, the academic conferences where their significance is debated, all of these fade into a deeper recognition that the real gospel, the living word, exists not in any written text, but in the ongoing conversation between human seeking and divine mystery.
as the boundaries between orthodox and heretical, canonical and apocryphal, ancient and modern dissolve in the gathering darkness, I understand that the lost Gospels were never really lost. They were simply waiting, like seeds in winter soil, for the right season to bloom again in human consciousness. The voices of Thomas and Mary, of Philip and Judas, of all the alternative witnesses to early Christian diversity, blend now into a single whisper that speaks not of division, but of the magnificent complexity of human response to divine love. Their Gospels become not competing versions of truth, but complementary facets of a mystery too large for any single perspective to contain.
The sacred marriage that Gnostic Christians celebrated, the union of Christ and Sophia, of masculine and feminine principles, of heaven and earth, unfolds now not as doctrine, but as the natural rhythm of consciousness returning to its source, like waves that rise from the ocean only to fall back into the depths from which they came. The kingdom of heaven that Jesus promised, whether understood as future hope or present reality, as external gift or internal discovery, as divine grace or human achievement, reveals itself now as the space where all such distinctions cease to matter, where the seeking heart finds rest not in answers, but in the peace that surpasses understanding. The phantom library where all these texts rest together begins to fade as sleep approaches, but their whispered wisdom continues to echo in the spaces between thoughts, in the silence between heartbeats, in the darkness that is not absence of light, but the womb from which all illumination is born. Sleep now, seeker of hidden wisdom. The lost Gospels live on, not in any manuscript, but in the eternal conversation between your deepest questions and the mystery that calls to you from beyond all words, all texts, all traditions, the mystery that is closer to you than your own breath, more intimate than your own thoughts, as present as the love that holds you even now in its infinite embrace. The desert wind carries all voices home to silence, all questions home to peace, all seeking home to the rest that was always waiting at the heart of the search itself.
The phantom voices of ancient scribes and modern scholars grow softer now, their debates about authenticity and orthodoxy dissolving like morning mist over the Nile. I feel myself drifting between the world of historical inquiry and the deeper realm where all Gospels, canonical and apocryphal, orthodox and heretical, merge into the single story of humanity's eternal search for the sacred. The clay jars that protected these forbidden texts through 16 centuries of desert sleep become vessels of dreams themselves, their sealed chambers holding not just papyrus and ink, but the infinite possibility of spiritual discovery. Each manuscript unfurls in slow motion like a prayer made visible, its words flowing like water into the quiet pools of consciousness where wisdom is born. The Gospel of Thomas speaks its secret sayings into the gathering darkness, each paradox becoming a gentle wave that carries the mind toward deeper understanding. Mary Magdalene's voice blends with the desert wind,
her teachings about the soul's journey transforming into the natural rhythm of breathing, of letting go, of allowing consciousness to ascend through its own inner spheres toward rest. The divine feminine and masculine principles that these texts celebrate find their union not in theological debate, but in the simple harmony of sleep itself, the daily surrender that reunites the active mind with the receptive heart, the questioning intellect with the knowing silence that lies beneath all words. Let the whispered wisdom of these recovered voices carry you now toward the place where all gospels converge, not in any written text, but in the living word that speaks continuously in the depths of being, the good news that needs no preservation, because it is written in the very fabric of existence itself. The lost Gospels were never truly lost, for their deepest truth lives on in every heart that seeks, every mind that questions, every soul that dares to imagine that the mystery of divine love might be larger, more inclusive, more wonderful than any single tradition has dared to proclaim. Sleep now in the embrace of infinite possibility.